It was my last year of high school, about 10 years ago. I grew up at school as a kind of outsider. I wasn't bullied or anything, but I also didn't have any real friends. I didn't care about this lonely life, even though I graduated and then came home to play video games and immerse myself in these digital worlds. That was my escape. My home life wasn't what I would call bad. It was just my father and me, and I love my father. He worked hard to provide for me. When I was young, maybe 10 or 11, my mother got involved in some bad habits in her free time, if you understand what I mean. My father didn't want me to be exposed to that environment any longer, and we eventually moved. It was difficult, but it was for the best. He tried to help her over the years, but she always refused until one day she just disappeared without a trace. It was sad, but we both moved on. As I got older, my father had to leave once a month on the weekends for work. I didn't mind, though it might sound crazy to some people that he left someone my age home alone, but my father trusted me. On a certain weekend during my last year, I started my normal routine. My father left me some money for pizza and soda. We never had soda at home, so this big bottle with the pizza felt like a double gift to me. My evening began to unfold like every other evening I'd spent alone at home. I devoured the pizza and drank most of the soda. After a short break on the sofa, I went to my room and started playing on the PlayStation. That's how I spent most of my weekends, even when my father was home. Normally, I played Call of Duty, but Grand Theft Auto Online had just come out, so I spent some time on that. After a few hours, I decided to play the single-player story mode. The older I got, the less I played the story in games, but for some reason that night I wanted something with a bit of substance, even if it was GTA. Since I wasn't playing online anymore, I took off the headphones. Although I played a lot, I hated wearing headphones for a long time. I had been playing the story for a while when I thought I could hear something from downstairs. There were no loud or conspicuous noises, just these small vibrations and tapping sounds. I'd been home alone many times and couldn't recall ever feeling such vibrations or hearing such noises, but at the same time, the sounds weren't alarming enough to really scare me. It was a little after 1 a.m., and I think it's subconsciously a bit scary when you're home alone at that hour. Every few moments, I heard a soft, contemptuous sound. I paused the game and tried to listen carefully. When I listened, I mostly heard silence and maybe a quiet knocking sound now and then. Just because I was alone, of course, the quick thought of an intruder crossed my mind. I'm even embarrassed to say that for a moment I decided this. I practically crept into the kitchen, moving so slowly. When I was only a few meters from the kitchen door, I could hear the noises as if someone were rummaging through my kitchen cabinets, accompanied by a gentle melody being hummed, and that humming was so unsettling. I almost expected to see a large and terrifying burglar, but the voice suggested something else. I looked into the kitchen, and in the corner by the sink stood a very small woman. Her hair was disheveled and flowing in all directions. I had my phone in my hand, ready to call the police, but I think the situation paralyzed me with fear and also incredible curiosity. Then I recognized the melody the woman was humming. She was humming, "I've Got No Strings" from Disney's Pinocchio, and I almost fainted at that moment because I knew who this person was. She always sang that to me when I was very young, and it was one of the few memories of my mother that remained. I couldn't move, and I must have trembled because she heard me turning. A broad smile appeared on her face, and although it was my mother, she wasn't the mother I remembered. Her teeth seemed rotten, and her eyes looked sunken deep into her face, and her voice, which should have been soothing but somehow wasn't, said, "There's my baby. What are you doing awake at this hour?" I didn't answer. I just stood there like a statue. She approached me and put her dirty hand on my shoulder and said, "What should I do about your father? He's always rummaging through the cabinets." I swear, that man never listens. Then she began to laugh, but it was not charming. It sounded like the laughter of a repulsive cartoon character. She turned around, started humming again, and rummaging through the cabinets. I snapped out of my trance, went back to my room, and locked the door. Then I immediately called the police and my father. My father made sure I stayed in my room with the door locked. He didn't go into detail, but he said my mother could be dangerous and that I needed to stay safe. The police came and I heard a small scuffle. I heard my mother telling the officers to get out of her house. The police knew the situation from me and from my father, who called them after I did. I heard a brief struggle and then silence for a moment. Then I heard an officer call my name, telling me that everything was okay and that I should come downstairs. I talked to the police for a while as another officer took my mother away. One officer stayed outside my house all night, until my father came home alone the next morning to help me feel safer, which I really appreciated. My father came home early the next morning and spoke to one of the officers. I could tell by his body language that he was uncomfortable and that we might have been lucky to prevent something horrible. My mother really didn't know where we lived, or at least she shouldn't have known. We had moved far away, and my father never told my mother where we moved to in order to protect me. She broke in through a ground floor window. I didn't hear it at all, so it must have been when I had the headphones on or something. I imagine my mother simply humming in the kitchen, waiting for my father while I was upstairs, and that thought still scares me today. It's been about 10 years, and I've only seen my mother twice since that night. She has been in some sort of facility for years now. She no longer remembers that night, and in any case, she doesn't have many memories left. It's sad, but it's true. Every time I hear that silly song from Pinocchio now, I freeze a little and just hope to forget the fear I felt that night and find a way to remember my mother in a positive way. One of the things I hate more than almost anything else in the world is when someone is waiting for me. I mean, not in restaurants or anything like that, but in life in general. I've always been pretty stubborn, and when I met my husband, we didn't connect right away because we literally fought over who would pay the bill. Let's fast forward to now, and we have a good balance in things. One of the things I normally do is take care of the house, especially the kitchen. I can't stand a messy kitchen and dirty dishes in the sink, and he's known for leaving dishes in the sink, so I handle the kitchen chores when I can. A few weeks ago, I had to undergo knee surgery. Last summer, I injured my knee playing softball and finished the game anyway, which damaged my knee further. I put off the surgery as long as possible, but the pain was too much. It wasn't even the surgery that bothered me, I actually wanted to get it over with. I was more worried about being practically bedridden for a while. My husband is fantastic, and I knew he would take care of me, but I also knew that the kitchen would be a mess. I'm sure that sounds controlling, but I don't care. I just love to make sure everything is clean. The day came, and the surgery went well. I lay in bed, and I hated it. It felt like I was locked in a cell. I was told not to move for several days, unless I had to use the toilet, and even then, I would need help. Luckily, we had a bathroom in our bedroom, so I only had to hop a few steps if I needed to go. On the first night back home, I lay in bed, and by the next day I was already restless. I took a few hops to the bathroom, and when I was done, I realized I was actually moving pretty well. When my husband went to work, he begged me to stay in bed, and he would take care of the kitchen and dinner when he got home. All I could think about was the kitchen being a mess. It didn't take long for me to convince myself that it was okay to go downstairs for a little while and just wash the dishes. I took my time on the stairs because I have to admit it wasn't an easy task. When I got downstairs, I smelled something strange. It didn't smell like trash or old food, which I half expected to smell coming from the kitchen. What I smelled at first was something I thought might be a cheap cologne, but I know my husband doesn't wear cologne. Then it hit me harder as I took a few more steps. It wasn't cologne I smelled, it was Axe body spray. I recognized it immediately. In middle school, all the teenage boys sprayed it on after gym class to mask their body odor, and I will never forget that terrible smell. I hopped a few more steps. I should have had my walker at this point. The smell was so strong I thought I could taste it. I knew my husband didn't use it, because by now I would have easily smelled it on him. I wanted to text my husband and say, "Hey, don't be mad, but I actually went downstairs. Why does it smell like Axe body spray down here?" After I sent it, I went into the kitchen, and I have to be honest, I was surprised it wasn't a mess. There was a small plate and a fork in the sink, and other than that, he had done a good job keeping the kitchen clean. I went over to wash a few things in the sink and noticed that the back door, which is located in the kitchen, was slightly open, more half open than open, but still not closed. Maybe this isn't a big deal to some people, but we rarely use that door. If we go into the backyard, we usually go through the side door. Normally, we keep that door locked and place the recycling bin in front of it. I dragged myself over a bit more to investigate and noticed that the bin had also been moved a few inches. It looked as if the door had been opened from the outside and the bin pushed out of the way to let someone in. I already knew the answer, but I still texted my husband and asked, "Did you open the back door for any reason?" He didn't respond immediately. I sat down on the sofa and tried to piece it all together, to give it a reasonable spin. The thought that someone had broken into the house didn't even cross my mind, because we live in a very nice area where almost no crime occurs. My husband called me a few minutes later and told me he had called the police just to be safe, to make sure no one had broken in, and that he was also on his way home from work. I hung up the phone and sat there silently, waiting for the police and my husband to arrive. And then, without me noticing, the door of the living room closet slammed open. A large man dressed in black came out of the closet and went out through the back door. As he passed by, the axe smell was incredibly overwhelming. I tried to hop to the window, but I could only catch a brief glimpse of the man as he ran along the side of the house. I noticed a very thick beard, and that was practically all. He was out of sight in seconds. Shortly after, the police arrived, and then my husband. I gave them all the information I had, but as I said, I didn't really have much for the police. The most unsettling part is that the officers are certain the person didn't break into the house. There were no signs of forced entry, which leads the police to believe that whoever this intruder was might have had a key to the house. My husband immediately went out and bought new locks for all the doors and made sure all the windows were locked as well. No other neighbor reported anything suspicious, which makes it even more likely that this person specifically targeted our house. Nothing was stolen either, which raises the question, what the hell did he want if not to bathe in body spray and leave the door half open? Whatever he wanted, maybe he got it. All of us have experienced traumatic things that happen to us in life. Some are much worse than others. When I was in high school, something traumatic and terrible happened to me when I stayed over at a friend's house. His parents went out of town on Saturday night to celebrate their wedding anniversary, and he invited me to stay over so we could spend time together and he wouldn't be alone. We invited a few more people, played some games, but in the end, everyone left around 11 p.m. or so. He and I hung out a bit longer but then decided to go to bed around 2 a.m. We were half asleep and watching The Office when we heard a loud bang downstairs. I thought it sounded like the door, but my friend said he thought it was a neighbor and that we should just ignore it. By this time, he was pretty tired, and now we were both about to fall asleep, so initially we didn't overreact. Maybe it was just the neighbor. I mean, it could have been a bird that flew into the house or something. Just as we convinced ourselves that there was nothing to worry about, the banging on the door started again, almost in perfect rhythm. The pounding on the door echoed through the entire house. At that moment, we had no idea what to do. This was clearly not a neighbor. This was reality. Someone was knocking at 2 in the morning. Every few seconds, the knocks returned. Sometimes they were louder, sometimes softer. No matter what kind of knocking it was, the thought of someone standing outside at this time was enough to scare us to the core. We both quietly moved to one of the windows to get a look at who was knocking. It was just a normal man. He didn't look like an addict, a criminal, or even remotely suspicious. He literally looked completely normal. He wore what looked like a good pair of sneakers, jeans, and a nice Nike polo shirt that you could even wear to play golf. His hair was short and neatly groomed, and he was clean-shaven, not a creepy-looking person, yet still so strange and unsettling at this hour. We looked at each other in confusion, trying to process what was happening and figure out how to handle it. Then he started banging on the door again, and we jumped up. Remember, it was 2 a.m., so even a Girl Scout selling cookies would be disturbing at this time. I watched from the window while my friend tried to call his parents. He had no success but kept trying. He wasn't smart enough to call the hotel or wherever his parents were staying. Eventually, the guy just left, but the relief was short-lived. Maybe 30 seconds later, He came back and stuck a note to the front door. This time, he didn't knock or anything. He just left the note there. He sat on the front steps for almost 5 minutes and then left. I kept watching out the window but couldn't see him anymore. We both decided that whoever that guy was, he was now gone. My friend went to unlock the door, and I yelled at him to stop. He told me the guy was gone and that I shouldn't worry anymore. I wanted to know what the note said, and I'm not going to lie, I was curious. My friend opened the door and grabbed the note. While he was peeling the tape off the door, we heard a loud voice in the distance. "Hey, you!" We both froze and looked up. The man who had knocked on the door stepped out from the bushes across the street and started approaching the door. We both screamed as we slammed the door shut. Another large man came out of the bushes following the first man. My friend slammed the door shut and was lucky enough to lock it before they reached it. Both men began pounding on the door, not knocking, pounding. I looked out the window and saw the bigger man, who wasn't there originally, slamming his shoulder against the door. The pounding was relentless, and we began to fear the worst. Finally, my friend called the police, and the guys outside must have heard what we were saying because they fled immediately. The police arrived, and luckily they were able to contact my friend's parents, and they came straight home. The worst part of all this was the note that was stuck to the front door. It was a very violent and detailed note about getting into the house to get money. I remember it said things like, "No more messing around, no more excuses," and many other things along those lines. The note was signed with a name like Peter. His father denied everything and kept swearing he had no idea who this Peter was or what the money was about. I remember it being very strange and very uncomfortable around that family until it was all forgotten. My friend and I have never forgotten that night, and we still talk about it today. I wonder all the time if his father was secretly involved in something. I mean, the note was addressed specifically to him, with his name. They knew where he lived, and after that night, nothing ever happened again. It all seems so bizarre, but I guess I don't know enough about the dark side of society to know if this is normal or not. We never got any closure about that night, and believe me, I tried. One evening, we pestered his father for an hour for information, and he just rolled his eyes and said maybe it was a crazy person playing a prank. Whatever it was a terrible night and a horrible memory that I will always carry, and to this day, I don't like being home alone. Let me start by saying that this story is a bit depressing, and it makes me sad to write it, but that doesn't change the fact that it was one of the scariest nights of my life. My father died when I was 4 or 5 years old. My mother met Marcus when I was 10, and he adopted me a few years later. Even though Marcus wasn't my biological father, he raised me as his own daughter, and I loved him as if he were my real dad. He was a great man, and treated my mother and me as if we were the most important things in the world. A few months ago, Marcus died. He got sick suddenly and died soon after. It was sad and hit my mother very hard. He was older, but that didn't make the pain any less. My mother, who already had health issues, feared this might be the final blow that would break her. A few nights after the funeral, my mother called me in the middle of the night. Every time she called me then, I thought, "Oh no," and feared the worst. It was bad, but not the kind of bad I expected. I was afraid. 2 nights in a row, she called me, claiming that someone was in her house. I could hear her walking around, and she was incredibly frightened. My husband and I felt terrible. On both occasions, we went there and searched the whole house but found nothing unusual. It seemed as if no one had broken in, nothing was stolen, and we checked everything to make sure it was securely locked. On the 3rd day, my mother begged me to spend the night with her. If the intruder showed up again, I could witness it and stop him or call the police or something. Honestly, I just thought my mother was very tired and perhaps dreaming and thinking her dreams were real, or something like that. Sometime during the night, I thought I heard someone or something coming from the dining room. It was shocking because it was clearly a voice. For a second, I thought my mother was right, and someone was breaking in. I stood up slowly from the sofa and started moving toward the sound. I dismissed the idea of ghosts because I don't like them, and started thinking maybe it was a homeless person or something illegally occupying the house of this older woman. All these thoughts raced through my mind as I approached the sound. When I was just a room away, I could clearly hear the voice. It was my mother. I stopped listening and stepped into the dining room. My mother was sitting at the head of the table, having a full conversation with no one. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen. Her eyes were wide open but almost glassy. She was both awake and asleep, and although she never looked in my direction, I knew she knew I had entered. In a cheerful voice, she said, "Hello, darling. I'm just enjoying some time with Marcus." I looked to the side and saw that the chair next to her was slightly pulled out, as if my mother had pulled it out so someone could sit on it. I approached my mother, and her eyes looked even eerier. It was as if I could only see the whites of her eyes, and combined with her smile and her conversation, it was incredibly creepy. I tried gently telling my mother that Marcus was dead, and she just laughed and said, "You're so dumb. Marcus is sitting right here." I was speechless. I didn't know how to handle it. Should I let my grieving mother be happy and believe she was talking to her deceased husband? Or should I try to bring her back to reality and her overwhelming grief? She took my hand, still not looking me in the eyes or changing her facial expression, and said, "You can go now, dear." I don't know why I was so scared. It was only Marcus, who had cleaned the house the night before. It was only Marcus. It was only Marcus. I remember every word. She kept repeating that last part over and over. The sleepwalking talk turned into babbling, and occasionally I heard the name Marcus come out of her mouth. I didn't realize that night how hard the loss had hit my mother and how fragile her mind had become. When I tried to move my mother, she became angry and growled like an animal and said, "Don't touch me, I'm talking to him." I called my husband, and he came to me, and we decided to call emergency services because we didn't know what else to do. When they tried to take her to the hospital, she became extremely hostile and even violent. Not because we were taking her out of her house, but because we were taking her away from Marcus. She kept saying that she couldn't leave because Marcus wanted her to stay there. The mind can conjure all sorts of things when it's hurt, and my mother passed away shortly after that night. May she rest in peace. She was never herself again after that night. Her half-open eyes and sleepwalking look never returned to normal. The doctors told me she suffered some sort of nervous breakdown and, due to her age, could no longer distinguish reality from her mind. It's really sad. When my biological father died, my mother was devastated, but she suppressed those emotions to raise me. Marcus saved her in many ways, so when she lost him, it was as if she lost almost everything. Excuse me if the story was depressing, but I will never forget how my mother acted that night. I'm a skeptical person, but part of me almost believes that Marcus was there with her. It's creepy, but the mind is a crazy tool. Even the fact that my mother thought the man was with her scares me a bit. Take care of yourselves, friends, and tell your loved ones you love them as often as you can. I think the word toxic is truly poisonous, and we throw it around like a frisbee. A topic that always comes up in this conversation about toxicity is toxic ex-partners. Oh, how terrible exes are. Not all exes are bad, although those who are really embody the word toxic. A few years ago, I was engaged, and it ended very badly. My fiancée got a job about 180 kilometers away from our hometown, so I moved with her and started a life there. I had no friends, no family, and no one to turn to when we broke up. Because of the job I had started, I decided not to return home just yet. It's not important how things ended, but they ended very badly. She begged me to come back, but I couldn't subject myself to that pain again. Right after the breakup, she stayed in the house, and I found a small one-room apartment. I just hoped I could meet some new friends, which I'm really bad at. A few weeks after the breakup, I was sitting in the apartment whining, which was my favorite hobby at the time. The apartment was on the first floor of the building, which was actually like a semi-basement, if that makes sense. My windows were at eye level, only my head was above the ground, and the rest of the apartment was below. I had a delightful view of nothing to help me deal with my overwhelming depression at the time. At night, while I was lazing around, the power went out. We had quite a strong storm, and the last time we had such a storm, the power was out for several hours. I knew I couldn't just stay still, and since it was already late, I couldn't go anywhere even if I wanted to. I lit a few candles I had and sat at my small table. It was a tiny table that fit only 2 chairs. I used to draw and paint in high school and had some talent before I stopped. This was the perfect opportunity to draw and just get lost in something I used to love. While I drew and tried to get my ex out of my head, I heard something. It was a loud noise and sounded pretty close. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see anywhere outside the small area lit by my candles. I slowly walked to where I heard the noise, and outside my window, something shaped like a figure was lying there. I jumped back because I was scared, even though I knew it was crazy. No one would break into this apartment. They would have to lie on the ground and practically crawl to the apartment. Not to mention that hardly anyone in this town knew who I was. I went back to the small table and blew out the candles so I could use the darkness to my advantage and see better through the window. At this point, I wasn't sure what I had seen, and it could have been nothing. It could have even been a skunk or something trying to get out of the storm. I just didn't know. I went back to the window and could see it clearly now. That was no animal, and it was no illusion. Outside on the ground, someone was trying to open the window and was dressed in dark clothing. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. The obvious answer would have been to call the police or the authorities or whoever, but I don't know why that didn't occur to me in the heat of the moment. The only person I really knew was my ex-fiancée, and I decided to give in to my fear and loneliness and ask her for help. And just as I hit the call button, you could see a light shine through the window and hear a short melody of a ringtone. The call went straight to voicemail, I guess, and knowing what was probably happening, I decided to call again to see if it was a coincidence. Indeed, the light and the ringtone went on for a moment before the intruder turned it off. My ex was trying to break into my apartment. Why at this time and in this weather? Her intentions were obviously sinister. I started screaming, and she kept trying to get through the window, but luckily it stayed locked. I called the police, and as soon as she heard me on the phone, I saw her stand up and run away. I told the police everything when they arrived. At first, they didn't really believe me and seemed almost annoyed, as if I were bothering them with this incident. But when they looked out the window, they could see the place in the ground where someone had been lying, and there were clear signs of attempted forced entry. Eventually, they agreed to investigate further and find out where my ex was. When the officers questioned her, she seemed to deny everything, which didn't surprise me. She said she was over at her new boyfriend's and that I needed to move on. This guy backed her up too, saying she'd been home with him all night. Either he was involved or she was already manipulating him. I caught her lying, and I ended up being the one who looked crazy and toxic. When I mentioned that I had called her twice and both times the phone answered, she said her phone was broken, so it couldn't have been her, and that was it for me. I couldn't live in that city anymore, and now that I didn't feel safe here either, I paid a fee to end my lease early and moved back home to stay with my family until I got back on my feet. I never heard from her again, and I'm very grateful for that. My life is much better without that toxic person who ruined my life. Being harassed at night is terrifying. Over the years, I've read and heard enough stories that I'm almost numb to the idea of being stalked. I say this now, but I'm sure if I were actually stalked by a madman, I'd probably jump out of my skin in fear. However, I will say that from first-hand experience, I know what it's like to potentially stare death in the face, and that, my friends, is the scariest thing on the planet. It's not always the armed lunatic you have to fear. Trust me. Last year, I decided to rent this little cabin practically in the middle of nowhere. I don't like people and hate the city, so I just wanted to get away and live in nature for a while to hear the trees, the wind, and the wildlife. This place was charming, and its location was perfect. It was in the mountains but still got full afternoon sun. It was the closest thing to paradise I had ever experienced in this area. It's not uncommon to see wild animals near your cabin, like deer, or even bears in some cases. A few weeks before, a couple of bears came and tried to get some food from my cabin but had no luck. I wasn't scared. I was excited. I took some cute videos that I can enjoy for the rest of my life. However, one night in the cabin, things turned bad. I might have drunk a little too much and, as a result, fallen asleep in the recliner in the main room of the cabin. To give you an idea of the size of this place, there was a small kitchen like you'd find in a typical apartment, then just one main bedroom with a recliner, a small chair and a table, and a bed in the back. There was a small bathroom in the back with a shower. In other words, 2 people could not live in this cabin. And because I drank too much, I forgot to lock the door, which normally wouldn't be a big problem because this place was in the middle of nowhere. It was more a matter of convenience that I liked to lock the door when I slept. My nightmare was about to come true because I woke up to the sound of breaking and clattering noises coming from the kitchen where the door of the cabin was located. I thought I was being punished for the only time in my life that I didn't lock the door. What luck, having an intruder in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my pocket knife and quietly approached the door. Let me tell you, I wish it had been a human intruder going crazy in my kitchen. What I saw was a fully grown mountain lion. Its tail twitched back and forth as it let out this terrible growling roar. I don't know if it was a sound of enjoyment or if this thing was ready to tear my face off. Either way, I didn't want to take that risk. I backed away to the other side of the wall and tried to figure out how to escape this situation. In the small bathroom, there was a tiny window I could certainly climb through, but I was too scared to make noise, fearing that this huge cat would hear me. The more the puma growled, the more afraid I became. Finally, I ran to the bathroom. The cat heard me. If you want something scary, search on YouTube for the sound of a puma growling. Now imagine that just a few meters away from you. It was one of the worst things I've ever heard. As I ran to the bathroom, I slid the door shut. It wasn't even a proper door, just a sliding panel. I held it as tightly as possible while trying to figure out a way out. While I held the door, the puma started hitting its head or something against it. It roared, which certainly made the animal even more nervous. For once, the tiny bathroom worked in my favor. I could hold the door with one hand and, on the other side, open the window. I didn't care if I lost my security deposit, so I kicked the screen out and jumped out with a single leap. As soon as I let go of the door, the puma could open it, and all I remember was that evil head growling as it tried to jump out the window. But either it couldn't or didn't want to. I ran to my car, which luckily was unlocked, got in, and locked the doors. I didn't have my keys, so I couldn't drive away, but at least I could lock the doors. Eventually, I saw the puma about an hour later come out of the cabin and walk around the car. This creepy cat continued making those deep, growling noises and occasionally showed its teeth. By sunrise, the puma finally retreated somewhere. Before leaving the car, I dashed into the cabin. The place was trashed. I grabbed my keys and my phone and drove into town. I called the property owner, and the guy kind of laughed. I had just had the worst night of my life with an animal I thought would rip my throat out, and this guy laughed and basically said, "Yeah, that can happen out here. In case you didn't notice." I left that day, and yes, I had to pay for the damages because you have to love those contracts. Suffice it to say, nature is no joke. It was definitely the worst experience of my life, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone except maybe the property owner. I'm just kidding. But since then, I've found a partner and have to be honest, I no longer like being alone. Maybe I'm getting older. Maybe that experience shook me to my core. The only thing I can say with absolute certainty now is that I'm definitely a dog person. People can be very strange. We can even influence people we don't notice. It just amazes me what thoughts can go through other people's minds. I will tell you my story, and you will understand what I mean. At that time, I was working a lot. I was saving money to buy my girlfriend a ring spoiler. We're married now. We rented a small house, but at least it was better than an apartment because we didn't have to share walls. I was also saving money to buy a house. She was also saving money for the same reason. Because I worked so much, she decided to volunteer for a 5-day retreat with the company she worked for. She would get a lot of overtime, which would allow me to work even more at my job. I would miss her, but it seemed like a great opportunity to earn some extra money, especially with the holidays approaching quickly. On Wednesday, as I went to work, I noticed a strange smell in my car. It wasn't a bad smell, just very strange. It smelled like perfume, but the kind a younger girl would wear. A few thoughts ran through my head, but I ended up attributing it to something peculiar I couldn't understand, and honestly, I didn't care. It was just a small detail after all. That night, I had a terrible time sleeping. I told myself it was probably because I missed my girlfriend. I was used to having her around, and now it was the third night in a row I slept alone. I swear I could hear noises coming from downstairs all night, but they weren't loud enough or scary enough to raise an alarm. So I ignored the strange signs again, and told myself it was probably just house noises or the wind. Thursday morning came, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I made myself some coffee and waited for it to wake me up soon. When I got to the car, I found it unlocked. I'm usually good about locking the car door, but I had been working so much that the thought that I might have forgotten didn't seem impossible. I ignored the unlocked door and got in, driving to work. The same story as the day before. I could smell that perfume again, and now some red flags started popping up. I couldn't even start to think about what could be happening. Every thought I had ended with me blaming myself for being too tired or missing my girlfriend. That was the most logical explanation to me at the time. I left work that afternoon, and again, the smell in my car was definitely perfume. I even had a coworker come and sniff around my car to make sure I wasn't going crazy. He said he could clearly smell it too. He guessed it might be my girlfriend's perfume, and since I missed her, I was unconsciously noticing scents I might have overlooked before. I knew my girlfriend's perfume, and I knew that wasn't it. But what he said seemed somewhat logical, and I just assumed he was right. Maybe my sense of smell had changed. When I got home again, I could smell only that scent, and now I was really uneasy. I still tried to convince myself that my coworker was right, but it didn't work. I decided to take a shower and then go out to eat and have a few drinks at a bar to relax. My girlfriend would be back the next afternoon, and it was also my first day off after 13 days, so I was ready to relax. I came home late that Thursday night, maybe around midnight, got ready for bed. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the front door. At that moment, I was more annoyed than anything else. Something so strange was bothering me. I went to bed shortly after I arrived and started sleeping. I knew she would be home the next day, so I hoped all the weird smells would vanish. I must have fallen asleep for a while because I was awakened by someone getting into bed on the other side of it. For a moment, I thought it was my girlfriend. I was half asleep, and my mind immediately went to her as she crawled into bed. She shushed me, and I turned around. She began to cuddle up to me as if I were the big spoon, something she had never done before. But I was so tired and so happy she was home that I didn't mind. Maybe a minute later, I suddenly opened my eyes. I looked down, and a woman's arm was draped over my body, holding me close. I smelled the arm, and immediately recognized the perfume. This was not my girlfriend. Then I snapped back to reality and remembered that she wasn't supposed to come home until the afternoon. Why would she come home in the middle of the night? I jumped out of bed in shock. I turned on the light, and there sat some young girl, probably in her 20s, on my bed. She smiled and kept pushing her hair out of her face. She called me honey and kept trying to calm me down. I screamed at her to get out of my bed, but she just kept smiling. I called the police, and she didn't even react. She just kept trying to shush me and tried to continue stroking my arm. I was beside myself and told her the police would come. She didn't care. She didn't look crazy or anything. She seemed pretty normal. She was also wearing a very small, low-cut pajamas, and when she got up from the bed to comfort me, she put on a low-cut robe. The police arrived, and I rushed to them, pleading my case, and the woman just stood there, letting me do it. She wasn't armed, she hadn't tried to hurt me, and she had no prior problems with the law or anything like that. Later, I found out she was just some girl from down the street where we lived. She was so quiet that I didn't even know she existed. While I lived in this house, she developed some kind of obsession, a crush on me. When she noticed that my girlfriend wasn't around for a few days, she began breaking in. The poor girl was convinced I was in love with her. Throughout all of this, she was never dangerous, and luckily that was the case. Who knows what would have happened if she had intended to harm me. Even though the woman had no intention of causing harm, that doesn't make the situation any less creepy. I had a sort of stalker who lived in my house for almost a week and climbed into bed with me. She never returned home, and we moved out soon after. From what I understand, she had a family, and they were informed. The last I heard is that she was treated for some sort of illness. I'm not sure what it was, so excuse my ignorance. Now you understand what I mean when I say people are strange. You never really know what might happen. I was working late one night in my office to finish a report due in a few days. I had some tea to keep myself awake and tried to finish as quickly as possible. Staying up late to work was something I often had to do for my job, and I always found it hard to stay focused once I got tired. While I was in my office, at some point I heard a knocking at the front door. I stood up and looked down the hall. I didn't know why anyone would be at my door at this hour. I went to the other end of the house and looked through the peephole, but there was no one on my porch. I stepped back and thought maybe it wasn't really the door. I had been so focused on work and was on the other side of the house that when I heard the light knocking, I just assumed it was someone at the door. I didn't know what else it could be, but I just returned to my office and continued working. Maybe I should have been more worried about what the knocking was, but I was so tired and wanted to finish my work that I didn't even think about it. After a few minutes, I sat back down at the computer and typed for about an hour. It seemed like nothing else happened since the knock, but I was getting more and more tired. My workflow slowed down, and my eyes grew heavier. Just as I was about to call it a night, I reached for my tea, and directly at the window on the other side of the room were a pair of eyes looking at me. All I could say at that moment was that it was a man, but he quickly pulled back after noticing I'd seen him. My heart pounded in my chest, and I just stood there staring at the window. It was so unexpected that I almost went into shock. After a moment, I stood up and ran to the window to cover it. I didn't know who it was or why he was watching my house like that, but it was late at night, which made it even scarier. I left my office and went to the front of the house to look through the peephole again to see if he had gone to the front yard, but I saw no one. Then I went to a window at the back of the house to look around, but again, there was no one outside. Adrenaline rushed through me, and I was no longer tired at all. But the silence in the house now scared me. Was the man gone, or was he still outside? I returned to my office, grabbed my phone, and began making my way to the front door. My plan was to call the police while keeping an eye on the doors and windows. But as I walked down the hallway, I saw a large figure standing at the end of the living room. He was tall and wore thick clothing to hide his identity, but his eyes were not the same as the ones I'd seen at the window. This was someone else. The man didn't hesitate as he walked toward me. I turned and ran back to my office, locked the door, and pressed myself against it, preparing for him to try to break in. As he approached the door, he stopped and just stood outside. I could hear him breathing. Then he began pacing back and forth as if he were strolling through the hallway. But then I heard it again, a light knocking sound on the other side of the house. The man outside my door began moving back toward the living room. Then it was quiet for a few minutes as I stood there against the door. Nothing happened at all. I quietly called the police on my phone and begged them to come quickly. I waited about 5 minutes before I heard the sirens approaching. As they forced my front door open and entered, there was no confrontation. I heard them go through the house and finally reach my door, and they never saw any of the men. To this day, I still don't know how the first man got in or what the two men intended. I think the knocking was their way of communicating, inside and outside the house. But then I wonder what that first knocking sound I heard was. The whole situation scares me every time I think about it, and I wonder how long the one had been watching me, and how long the other man had been in my house. It could have ended much worse for me, so I know I was lucky. But it's hard not to think about whether they will come back, and I don't want to rely on luck again. This happened just a few months ago. I had recently moved into a very small single-family house near my workplace. I used to have to drive almost an hour every day, so this move was really nice. The only thing was that I had never really been anywhere in the area except my workplace, so it was like moving to a completely new place. Anyway, that evening, I came home around 6 p.m., and drove straight into the garage. I had worked again and would have to work again the next day, so I didn't plan to do much, probably just relax and eat something before going to sleep. I went in through the garage and entered the house, warmed up some leftover pizza in the oven, but while it was heating, the doorbell rang. It actually startled me because I had never heard the doorbell before, and I had no idea who could be here. I went to the front door and looked out. It was a woman, around 50, with long gray hair. I opened the door and asked how I could help her. She gave me a wide smile and said she noticed that I had recently moved in. We talked for a minute as she asked about my background, whether I had a wife or children, all this trivial small talk. Then she said goodnight and left. I never even got the chance to ask who she was, but I assumed she was just an older woman who lived nearby. Still, something about her made me feel strange. I don't know how else to describe it. I wasn't sure if there was anything really odd about her, or if it was just that she was old. I returned to the kitchen, took my pizza, and sat on the sofa to look for a good YouTube video. I found a random commentary video that I let play in the background while I ate. But only about 10 minutes went by before I noticed a noise outside. I paused the TV and listened. I realized it was a car engine running, and it was really loud. I stood up and looked out the front window. A car was parked right in front of my house with its engine running, but all the headlights were off. I looked up and down the street and saw that it was completely empty, with plenty of other parking spots available, yet they chose right in front of my house. I watched the car for a few minutes, but nothing changed. I went back to the sofa. About half an hour passed with the engine still running loudly outside until it suddenly turned off. I paused the TV again and listened. After a minute, I heard nothing else. I got up and went to the window, looked out, and saw the car just as before, except now it wasn't running. Again, no one was outside. It was just this car. I closed the blinds just to be sure no one was watching me for some reason, and went back to the sofa. Only a moment passed before a soft knocking sound came from the other side of the house. Already a bit nervous, I walked down the hall and looked into the kitchen. For a moment, I saw the shadow of someone moving away from the back door as if they realized they'd been noticed and tried to hide their steps. I quickly ran around the house to the front and looked out the window. I saw a man get into the car that was parked right in front of my house and drive away immediately. The first thing I did was go to the back door and open it to find out why he was there. It only took me a few seconds to notice that the handle from outside was really loose, as if they had tried to remove it. Even by slightly wiggling it, I could see the internal mechanism of the door lock, which meant they probably could have unlocked it. He was only moments away from getting into my house. I can't say for sure if the old woman from before had something to do with it. I know it sounds strange that she did, but I thought about the questions she asked me, all of which had to do with whether anyone else lived with me. Maybe she was gathering information to see if I was a good target for whatever they were planning. It's been a few months now, and I've never seen her or that man again. Once more, over the last decade, I've lived a quiet life in Tapalpa, Mexico. I have a small cabin in a village where people live a life similar to mine. There's a town center with shops and everything, but most people have cabins or houses a few kilometers away, either with farms or just flat properties. I didn't have a farm or anything like that, but I have a lot of grassy land that borders some mountains. This happened almost 10 months ago. It was about 8 p.m., and I was sitting outside by the campfire with my laptop. I did this almost every evening except when it snowed. It was always a soothing way to end the evening before I went to bed, but this night was different. I sat there for an hour, really focused on my laptop, when through the crackling of the fire I heard something in front of me. I looked up and saw a man on the other side of the flame, maybe 5 meters away. The man looked like a typical man in his 40s who lives around Haritol and sturdy, with a big gray beard. I got up from my chair. "What are you doing here? Where did you come from?" I said, trying to hide the tremble in my voice. The man looked at me with a gaze I can only describe as someone on the verge of doing something terrible. But then he looked past me, toward my house. I kept my eyes on him as he started walking toward the front of the cabin. He went to one of the windows, quickly looked inside, mumbled something to himself, then turned and started walking away. I called out again and added some unfriendly words, But the guy just ignored me. He walked to where the grass meets the trees and then disappeared. It was completely crazy. Some guy here, right next to my house, at this hour, definitely not a coincidence. Especially not the way he acted, as if he was looking for something and not afraid to enter my space. I immediately put out the fire and went inside, locked the cabin, and took out my gun just in case. I didn't think he'd come back, but now I couldn't be sure about anything. I was alone, and the way things are out here, calling the police would take too long to be practical if something happened. I stayed awake for several hours, way past my usual bedtime, keeping eyes and ears open just in case. I don't remember what time it was, but it had to be at least 1 or 2 a.m. When I finally fell asleep on the sofa, I struggled hard to stay awake, but I couldn't. When I woke up, I heard a constant, unusual sound, the wind blowing through the house. I sat up, still confused and tired, and looked at the front door. It stood wide open. I jumped up and ran to the door, looked in all directions, but saw nothing in the darkness. I slammed it shut and locked it. Then I turned around to face the possibility that someone was inside my house. I stood there by the door and listened for a full minute for any sound of someone inside. It was a small cabin, so even something like heavy breathing would have been loud enough to hear. But it was absolutely silent, only the creaking of the wood from the wind outside. I slowly walked down the hallway and entered every room, checking every corner, opening every door, but no one was inside. Afterward, I stayed awake until sunrise. As soon as the sun came up, I drove into town and reported it at the police station, assuming that the man I saw that night was probably the one who broke into my cabin. The only problem is the motive. Some strange things were missing, which definitely meant someone had broken in and gone through the house while I was unconscious, but none of what they took had any real value. And of course, they didn't hurt me. So it remains unclear what they were aiming for. Without knowing why they came to my cabin, I can't say whether they'll come back or not.